Hi, everybody. Welcome to the final reading group session in what has been a really generous and generative series of sessions for the exhibition Gives On and With Decolonial Modes of the Transcultural, organized by the Art Gallery here in Vancouver and guest curated by Noah Bangu. And I'll just hand over to Nora in just a second, but I would like to acknowledge, first of all, that the Art Gallery operates principally in Vancouver, which is a city located on the unceded ancestral traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My name's Laurie White, and I'm the program coordinator here at the OR. And it's really been fun seeing how this exhibition sort of develops week to week. We had a great session last week with Glam Collective. So I'll hand it right over to Nora to introduce our speaker for today, or our reading leader, Mariana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nora Pangu, and I guess curated this exhibition that has featured so many great thinkers and makers over the last 2 months. And I'm currently based in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And before we really get into the exhibition and Mariana's talk, I do want to tell people that we are recording the session for the exhibition's archive. So if you're not comfortable sharing your image, maybe you could turn your cameras off. But otherwise, this documentation is really quite integral to the project. And so Gives On and With has been developing over the last few months and really sort of been held by Art Gallery for the last 2 months. And it's unfolded through a variety of forms, including a material exhibition, a reading groups, and soon a website as well. And its aim is to consider different perspectives on decolonization through diverse regional positions and affects as well, to really understand how the colonial spirit has moved across different landscapes and how it's traveled across time and space. So throughout these 2 months, we've been listening to artists from Canada and Norway who've shared their histories, their projects, and really framed that through specific readings that unpack some of the meatier stuff in their work. And all throughout, this project has really been rooted in Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation as well, and other texts as well that explore the possibilities of the transcultural and the aspirations of the transcultural as well. So that's a broader framework for the project. And in today's session, our final one, Mariana Muñoz Gomez will be sharing her practice through a close reading of late Cuban writer Antonio Benítez Rojo's text, The Repeating Island, which itself is a practice in rereading the Caribbean to understand its logic of repetition, rhythms, and networks. So I'm really excited to learn more about the text and Mariana's practice. And Mariana Muñoz Gomez is a Latinx artist, writer, curator, and settler of color based on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Her work is connected with language, place, identity, diaspora, and displacement within post and settler colonial contexts. Her lens-based practice involves a variety of media, including text works, screen prints, and photography. Mariana works collaboratively with a number of collectives, including Carnation Zine and Window Winnipeg, of which I'm also a member. She recently completed a Master of Arts in Cultural Studies, Curatorial Practices at the University of Winnipeg. So I'll hand it over to Mariana.
Thank you, Noor. As you mentioned, I'm here in Winnipeg, which is the traditional territory. It's located in Treaty 1, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Dakota, Dene, and who am I missing? Anishinaabe, Innu, Dakota, Dene, and it's the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I have another bit of a land acknowledgement that I'll share through an image in a moment as well. But I just wanted to start off by saying thank you to Noor for organizing this exhibition and the online programming. And thank you to Lori and Denise at the Art Gallery for your facilitation and your support. I wish I could see the exhibition in person, but maybe one day I'll be able to visit, even if the exhibition's not on anymore. But yeah, it's been really nice to be able to hear from Noor how it's going and to review some of the other artist talks that I haven't been able to make it to. And I also want to thank everybody who's here for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to having a more kind of casual and conversational approach. So I think I'll do my presentation, and then if there's questions at the end, it can be about anything that I've talked about today or anything that might be arising from the reading and from the artwork that I'll share today. So I'll start off by discussing a little bit about the text. I actually will just focus on a couple of themes that are significant to me coming out of this text, and it's a really rich article, and it's very complex, so I feel like it is worth a lot of rereadings in itself to kind of pull out the different layers that Antonio Benítez Rojo is writing about in there. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see my presentation. And view mode. Okay. So I wanted to start with a map just to locate the region and the histories, I guess, that the author Antonio Benítez Rojo is writing from. So he was a Cuban scholar and writer, and this text is very much focused on the Caribbean, but also connects that region to various different parts of the world. So in the text as well, he talks about the Antilles Islands as a land bridge, bridging what we can call North and South America. And this theme of bridging different places through our ideas of land and relationships to land will come up in a couple other ways in this presentation. One of those ways that I wanted to also just share this incredible resource, nativeland.ca. It's a global map where you can input your city or your state or wherever you're searching for, and you can visit different territories, languages, and treaties that have been mapped there. And this is a community resource, so it's actually updated by sending in suggestions and edits and corrections to the people who manage the website. So it's a really cool resource. And in my own work, and I guess my entry point into this article, which is very much based in the Caribbean, is that I was born in Mexico, which is not part of the Caribbean, but it's close by. And even then, I'm kind of interested in the global connections that Antonio Benítez Rojo is making through very disparate geographies. So Morelos, is where my maternal family is from, is kind of around here. It's a state. And then a lot of my paternal family is in Puebla, which is like right next to it. Obviously, there's been different migrations throughout my own family history, but that's kind of the two places that I call home, as well as Mexico City. And later on in my presentation, I'll be talking about recent work where I'm really drawing connections between my two homes of Winnipeg and Mexico, Morelos specifically. So I just wanted to pull up this map as well to talk about the Indigenous groups that have traditional territory in the state of Morelos, which again is very much not a static kind of record, but the information that I've been able to access today notes that there's Nawa, Mexica, and Tlahuica or Matzlalcinco or Oquiltec territory in the state of Morelos. And then as well, I just wanted to note that in considering this text and in considering the location that I'm talking from today, Winnipeg, I just wanted to note that some correlations, I guess, where Antonio Benitez Rojo really positions the Caribbean as a significant site of colonial expansion into the New World. And then through my own learning, I've learned about Winnipeg, which used to be known as Red River, as a significant site of colonial expansion into the Northwest. So Red River used to be a largely Métis settlement. And yeah, through the project of Canadian expansionism, there were a lot of different factors. There were economic factors, as well as military occupation of Red River that led to the signing of Treaty 1 and misunderstandings, as well as fraud that was involved in some of the numbered treaties in the land known as Canada. So yeah, I was just really interested in kind of linking all these places that I call home, and as well as the themes that Antonio Benitez Rojo talks about, just finding a lot of connections between these disparate geographies. So here I've noted a few themes, like I said, among many that have come out of this reading for me. And I was introduced to this reading just last year. So I've reread it a couple times, but I feel like every time I come back to it, it's so complex that there's different themes that I can pick out. So I'll start just telling you a little bit about these three. This first one, critical insularity, I've also linked to this idea of repeating machines that the author talks about and repeating cultural expressions. So the term critical insularity, I came to through some other texts that are written by American studies scholars who are taking a decolonial or decontinentalizing approach to American studies. So what that means, decontinentalizing, is instead of prioritizing the mainland or the continent as more authoritative, redistributing some of that power and authority to islands as well, and taking an approach, which Benitez Rojo does as well, of considering what we think of as continents as islands that are in relationship with the smaller islands around us as well. So this critical insularity is an approach to think about these places that we might think of as insular, whether it's islands or communities on one mainland, and recognizing that even though they may be geographically insular, they are very much connected through different networks. And then, so I see that connected to the repeating machines that comes up in Antonio Benitez Rojo's text. So he talks about repeating machines of colonialism and some of those different machines that are part of this bigger project are plantations, the Spaniard fleet system, and Mexican and Peruvian mines. Those are ones that he specifically names, although we can think about these different practices of extraction and forced labor and migrations in more global terms as well, and related to our own histories, I think. So he also talks about rhythms and returns a lot in his writing. So, you know, he talks a little bit about the culture of the Meta archipelago as an eternal return. So I'll touch on that a little bit later, but kind of thinking of the Caribbean as a site, he describes it as a meta archipelago, where there's really no center and there's no margin. So that's another practice of decentralizing this authoritative voice that we often, when we think of island and mainland, we often associate with the mainland. And then I also just wanted to talk a little bit about this term anti-explorer approach. This anti-explorer figure is another one that I've come across in some critical American studies texts. And they call this figure anti-explorer in contrast to the colonial explorer, who is a figure that sets out to map the unknown and categorize it in a way to understand the absolutes of the world. So to understand like absolute truths, specific definitions, specific categorizations. So the anti-explorer recognizes that not everything can be mapped out, not everything can be known. And I don't know if takes comfort is really the right term, but kind of like takes comfort in the unknown. And I've just got a few screenshots from the text that will go with some notes that I've highlighted here, just in my notes here. So this is the first page. And if you haven't read the reading, I encourage you to just download it and read it on your own time, because it's really interesting. But this is the first page, and I just selected this page to highlight because of this. In the very first line, he kind of talks about these themes of repeating machines and cultural expressions that come out of that, the rhythms, and this anti-explorer figure who doesn't know everything, is okay with not knowing everything rather than trying to pin everything down. So yeah, even just the first sentence, a profile of a group of various nations whose colonial experiences and languages have been different, but which share certain undeniable features. So I was really drawn to this line, and I think it relates a lot to my practice, as well as some interests that Noor has in these transcultural contacts and moments of cultural exchange and learning from each other. So often there are a lot of shared experiences, but there's also those differences that are can be really generative spaces, differences between two people in conversation or two cultures in conversation. And I also wanted to point out that in this text, there's some language that we might recognize as incorrect, like Antonio Benitez Rojo uses the term Indian when he means indigenous, and he also uses the term coolie, which is a loaded term as I understand it. It really just refers to laborers. So yeah, so I think if in conversation we refer to these groups of people, that we keep in mind these kind of outdated terms that the author is using. Okay, and maybe before I hop into this section, in the text, another entry point for myself, as someone who isn't connected to the Caribbean in terms of my own family history or anything like that, I was really interested in this whole text really positions the Caribbean as a significant site of colonial expansion and kind of the first contact point from the transatlantic slave trade. So it's a really, really heavy with a lot of difficult history and violent history. And this is reflected in the way that Antonio Benitez Rojo writes about it as well. There's a lot of very dense paragraphs where he kind of talks about a violent birth of the Caribbean as it's now known today. And then he also makes his way a little bit up the continent, where he talks about the fall of Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire. So to me, it was really interesting how he links these two disparate geographies into a shared history, which of course is very different in the way that it's expressed in these two places. These colonial histories are very different. But that was kind of my first entry point into this writing, and into even connecting it to my experience up here further north in Turtle Island. And then, yeah, in this section here, he talks about the Antilles as an island bridge connecting North and South America. And then he says, this archipelago, like others, can be seen as an island that repeats itself. So to me, that's a really great example, thinking about the Antilles as an island bridge. You know, there's individual and specific islands with their own specific cultures, but they're also a network, a related network. And when we think about them as an entity that connects North and South America, that brings those two bodies, North and South America, into conversation with the Caribbean, and is a great example of that decontinentalizing approach. Yeah, of including North and South America as part of the archipelago. I call it archipelago, but I think some people pronounce it archipelago. So thinking of North and South America as other islands in conversation with these smaller land masses that we might more easily recognize as islands. And then, yeah, this colonial history as a kind of non-geographical, but maybe more not necessarily conceptual, but as an island itself that repeats, or really a machine that repeats itself. Oh yeah, and I was also really interested, I mentioned briefly how Antonio Benitez Rojo refers to the Caribbean as a meta archipelago with no center. So he does this to extend the boundaries of the Caribbean, the region that we know as the Caribbean. So by conceptualizing it as a place, kind of as a historical site with no center, he's able to connect the Caribbean and its histories to, as he says, the outskirts of Bombay, to a Cantonese tavern, to a Portuguese lyric. So this really points to the connections that are made from various different types of global movements. So in a way, he's also talking about the Caribbean as a significant site to the beginnings of globalization, which is very, very much linked to colonialism. If we think about, you know, the colonial explorer looking for riches and how that led to the transatlantic slave trade and finding labor to find those riches that they were looking for, and these global migrations that were created through colonialism that resulted in the trade of materials over oceans, and existing trade routes that were in place before then as well, really leads to yeah, connecting colonialism and globalization to me. And it's you know, obviously it's part of reality today. And I was also interested in this idea of the Caribbean as a meta archipelago with no center, just because, again, it puts in practice, I think, that decontinentalizing approach where instead of thinking about our geographic locales in a very insular way, we can apply that critical insularity to recognize the networks that exist. So instead of thinking of even the capital of a province or the capital of a state, recognizing maybe more rural parts that are also in conversation with each other and with these capital cities, and decentralizing the authority that we give to these mainlands. Oh yeah, and then with this section of the text, let me make sure I'm at the right part of my notes here. I guess part of the trait of this writing, and part of the point that he's making as well, is how interconnected everything is. So I was just looking at my notes and I was like, well, even if I'm ahead of my notes in my slideshow, it's all interconnected anyway, so it'll all come together. But in this section that I've highlighted, I'll just read part of it. So I can isolate with frightening exactitude, like the hero of Sartre's novel, the moment at which I reached the age of reason. It was a stunning October afternoon, years ago, when the atomization of the Meta Archipelago under the dread umbrella of nuclear catastrophe seemed imminent. So he's using a lot of metaphors and some complex language. But I'll just continue down. So he says, while the state bureaucracy searched for news off the short wave or hid behind official speeches and communiques, 2 old Black women passed in a certain kind of way beneath my balcony. I cannot describe the certain kind of way. I will say only that there was a kind of ancient and golden power between their gnarled legs, a scent of basil and mint in their dress, a domestic wisdom almost culinary in their gesture and their gay chatter. And then he goes on to say, I knew then at once that there would be no apocalypse. The notion of the apocalypse does not exist within the culture of the Caribbean. So really in this part, although there's a lot of interesting sections, I wanted to focus on this certain kind of way that Benitez Rojo brings out, which again kind of links to that anti-explorer figure and a rhythm that comes up throughout his whole writing. So in this certain kind of way that he's talking about something that is unknowable and untranslatable. You know, someone in the culture will understand exactly what he's talking about, but there is no words to describe it to a reader outside of the culture. So he can only describe it as a certain kind of thing. He can describe the smells and the looks of what he's of the scene that he's describing. But to me, it really communicates this way of being and this reality that's untranslatable. So I think as well, this points to the repeating machines of colonialism that he talks about in this text, and how they've extended through the Caribbean into Mexico and everywhere else, and how he focuses on how these colonial machines result in impacting the cultures that are there and influencing new expressions as well of different cultures. So in this unknowability, there is something that we might resonate with, and then there's also value in recognizing a difference that maybe is something unknowable, and it's something that's different from our own experience. And yeah, maybe from there, well, I guess a couple of other notes, and then I'll move on to some images of my previous and recent work. Yeah, this relates to the way that these colonial machines have influenced existing cultures and influenced new expressions of culture as well. He talks about the Caribbean is colonized by many European groups. There's the Spanish, the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. And he also talks about indigenous peoples and languages that already existed there before then, as well as the slaves that were brought through Africa to the Caribbean through the transatlantic slave trade. And he notes as well new languages or Creole languages that he describes that arise. So even the expression of these new languages and their own complicated histories, the reasons that there are expressions of new languages come out of, yeah, very complicated histories. And it just, they carry these migrations in them as well as different knowledges in them. Yeah, so maybe from there, I'll just point out a few projects, and hopefully these threads are kind of evident in these projects. So like I said, I first came to this article just last year, but I've also included some works that I made before last year because I feel like this article puts into different words this experience of transcultural exchange and transcultural learning. So one series that I wanted to talk about that involved that was this photo series called ESL from 2017. And a couple of people that were involved in that series are here today. So I'm really glad, Hajim and Noor, that you're here. No pressure, but if there's anything you want to say about the series afterwards, please feel free. But in the series, I interviewed acquaintances and friends about their relationship to English. And I was really thinking about English as an imperial language. So yeah, again, just thinking of the Caribbean as this site of a lot of imposing languages and imposing powers and expressions of new culture. Here is really just addressing English. So I've also just noted parts of the conversation that came up that are incorporated in the image. I've noted them aside here. So some different themes that came up through these interviews were, you know, as immigrants considering bringing our languages to this place called Canada, and you know, thinking about what languages are valued or have space in what places and what histories, as well as our roles as migrants and as guests, as people living here, being involved in our own histories, and then coming into another place that has its own history. So this was a photo and an interview with my friend Francesca. And then I have an image here from an interview with Hajim. Just going to move my screen. So yeah, I'll just read out the text that was taken out from the interviews and incorporated into this image. So people bring with them histories in their tongue. So excited when someone starts speaking in Malay and I recognize words. Opportunity to nourish my roots. Softer relationship. So in this interview with Hajim, some themes that came up were these ways of being and ways of being in relation with others, depending on the language that you're relating through. So, you know, this chance opportunity of, at the time, running into someone in Winnipeg who's speaking in Malay and recognizing a softness towards them or a joy that comes out of hearing that language represented. And I'll just read another bit of excerpts from the interviews. This one's with Sylvia. So she was saying, the power of language, the power of that knowledge is beyond anything. The scoop really was breakdown of family, breakdown of culture, breakdown of everything. Talking about the 60s scoop. English and German, although both languages were not my indigenous language, talking about her first languages. It might have been in my blood memory, but I was never close to it. Language is sacred. Hopefully one day I'll be able to speak my language. So in a lot of my work, I'm really interested in language and, as Sylvia points out here, knowledge that is embedded in different languages, different knowledge, and how connected that is to culture and to family as well. And then this one's a bit of a interview and images with Noor. So again, here, relationships that come up in different languages comes up in this interview. Hindi, I speak with people who are complete strangers to me. So awkward to communicate this. I've lost a lot of words. I said thank you and bye in Punjabi. I got so much joy out of it. So also talking a little bit about language loss and first language loss through experiences of displacement and migration as well. And I'll just move a little quickly. I'm not sure how I am for time. Yeah. I just have some screenshots here. I can maybe show a bit of this video, but this is another project about language where I was interviewing more friends and acquaintances. So this is called Google Translate Videos, where I was interviewing people about their relationship to migration and concepts of home. So this one is a bit of an interview with my friend Igor. And the interviews were obviously held in English because that was our shared language. And then I would translate them into their first language, into the interviewee's first language for the video. And I would translate the text back and forth quite a few times on Google Translate to a point where eventually the text kind of lost meaning or it didn't quite make sense. So this still is from some point in a translation on Google Translate where you can tell it's not really quite how Igor would have said it. Like, it's not a wellness day. It was not a wellness day. Those weren't his original words, but that's what came after all the translation. So I was interested in connecting with other people with migration in their family history. And through the translation process, it ended up also incorporating topics of first language loss and, again, those relationships and those connections that can only be made through relating to someone in specific languages. So again, that in a certain kind of way thing that Antonio Benitez Rojo was talking about. Some things are just untranslatable, and losing one's first language can mean a lot of different things, including losing ways to relate to other people. And maybe I will play just a little bit of that video so you can see how the text flows in and out of each other. So this was an interview with Zara, who couldn't make it today. So maybe I'll pause it there because it's really the meaning that changes from each translation to each other. I'll move on to just a couple of more recent projects, and then yeah, I'll open up the conversation. So one of the recent projects I wanted to talk about, where I guess in this one still I wasn't really intentionally employing like a hemispheric or a critical insularity kind of approach, where I wasn't thinking of it as critical insularity and connecting disparate geographies. But in this work, Recorrer, to wander, I was interested in exploring the image and what it could mean for me in processing my experience as a diasporic person. So in this work, I included some images of my body in what I hope translate as action poses. So my body about to take movement, with images of home. These are landscapes and interior pictures of my grandparents' home. This is an airplane picture getting ready to land in Mexico City. And then this is a mountain landscape in the state of Morelos. So I was interested in thinking about embodying movement and embodying these different conceptions of home. And with this work and with the other works that I've shown you, thinking about these shared desires and movements and experiences. So similar to what Antonio Benitez Rojo said at the beginning of his text, talking about these shared experiences, but also finding or recognizing the significance in the differences. And I just have a couple other works to show you. So maybe I'll do a little reading of this artist book called Mapping Elsewhere, finalizing some edits to it. So hopefully it will be produced soon, and I have another reading of the full text coming up on May 6th. But I'll do a reading of an excerpt today. I'm not sure if you are still seeing my Safari screen, or can you see the PDF I have up? No? Okay, I'll stop sharing and then I'll share the PDF. Okay, so this is just a little bit of this artist book. So I'll just read out the text. As I keep walking and come back up by the drugstore, I decide I'm not ready to go home and walk over the bridge towards the legislative grounds. I head down to the right towards the river, the way I like going on my bicycle to feel the air rush by me. Winnipeg has a lot of Tyndall-stone architecture. I see it all around me in the structures leading down to the Riverwalk, the structures leading up to the Legislative Building, the platform where a statue of Louis Riel stands, and behind Riel, there is the Legislative Building itself, on top of which the Golden Boy stands. The Manitoba Legislative Building, completed in 1920, is a significant example of the stone in architecture. Other government buildings throughout Canada, such as Ottawa's Parliament buildings and the Canadian Museum of Civilization, have used Tyndall stone as it is well suited to harsh climates. Before the official Tyndall stone began being quarried around Garson, Manitoba in 1895, a similar limestone had been quarried since 1832 near Lower Fort Garry. In fact, the fort's walls and the governor's residence at this site were built with the Tyndall-esque limestone in 1832. Treaty 1 was signed at Lower Fort Garry 39 years later. Following organized petitions and actions by Anishinaabe in the late 19th century, preventing further Canadian development in their lands, Canada was forced to meet with them to negotiate a treaty. Representatives of the British Crown and Anishinaabe negotiators met at Lower Fort Garry in 1871 to discuss the Anishinaabe development plan for the region. Treaty 1 was signed, although it is unclear if the British Crown and the Anishinaabe fully understood each other's concepts of land ownership and views of belonging to the land. Anishinaabe Métis legal scholar Amy Kraft explains, the Anishinaabe did not surrender their land in the Treaty 1 negotiations. It was not in their power to do so, as they did not own the land. In their eyes, they were in a sacred relationship with the land endorsed by the Creator. Whereas Anishinaabe understood their relationship with land as fundamentally anti-capitalist, the Canadian expansionists built their imagined country on capitalist concepts of land as property to be owned, land as resource and wealth. So in this project, I'm connecting to Tyndall stone as this material that's very specific to a certain part of Manitoba. It's a limestone that is fossiliferous and it has some fossils in it, that you can see in various different sites, such as in the Manitoba Legislative Building or in other government buildings, as well as in the Winnipeg Art Gallery or in domestic settings. And in this artist book, as well as in some recent work that I'll show you in a minute, I'm connecting this stone and this very specific geography to a stone that has been part of my personal history, I guess, through my grandparents' house, and is also another stone that is specific to a specific geography in the state of Morelos and around that part of Mexico. So I'll just toggle between the screens I'm sharing here. And then these will be my last few slides. So in this project, this exhibition called A Volar Entre Rocas, or To Fly Between Stones, I'm bringing these two local materials into conversation and kind of employing that rhythm of flow and return that Antonio Benitez Rojo brings up in his writing, as well as bringing these two parts of the earth, these two different types of stones, into conversation with each other in an attempt to just process my relationships to home, as well as bringing up questions of relationship to land and how both of these materials have been used to claim certain land, like using the Tyndall stone in some government buildings, as well as this volcanic stone that you can see in the walls here. Like Tyndall stone, it's very present in domestic settings and public settings, and also in some structures like the Hernan Cortes's palace, who he was the first Spanish conquistador that Antonio Benitez Rojo references in his writing. In 1523, his arrival led to the fall of Tenochtitlan. And yeah, these are just my last couple of slides with my more recent work. And there's another image of the limestone. So maybe I will stop screen sharing, but if we want to come back to any of those images, just let me know. And yeah, I would just like to open up to some conversation, comments. If any of you got to read the text, that's great. And if not, if you have other comments and questions.
So thank you so much, Mariana, for taking us through the text and outlining some of like the key themes and just your interest in this like island thinking and like hemispheric sort of networking. And for like this exhibition as well, I did this sort of rereading of Edward Glissant's text, Poetics of Relation, and like found myself like, you know, like connecting more intimately to some of the content and like understanding the poetics and the politics of the text in a different way. So yeah, I really appreciated how you allowed us a space to like reread the Caribbean as well and rethink our different locations when we're thinking about the Caribbean and just how it operates in this sort of as a connective tissue between these different locations. And yeah, before we have a discussion, I also wanted to comment on like the image you included of me in ESL, because like the text that, or the quote that was about, I said thank you and goodbye in Punjabi. It made me so happy. Like it was in 2016, I think at the start of our relationship. And I think I remember like visiting Toronto for like a conference or something and meeting an older man at the airport who worked there, and he gave me directions and like we spoke in Punjabi. Just the fact that like he recognized me as part of his community and like we were able to sort of switch to that like common language was so exciting and like exhilarating for me at the time. And I remember like seeing Toronto as this like mecca of like relations and like these like tensions and conflicts, and also like, you know, these really great entanglements between like my own communities and others that I felt was missing in Winnipeg. And so looking at your work, it's exciting to see how, yeah, you're bringing these connections to light in regions that are not necessarily the center, or, I mean, according to Julie Nagum, Winnipeg is the center of the world, but yeah, like different regions outside of these like mainlands or yeah, big cities. So thank you. And yeah, I don't want to take up too much space. I do have some questions for Mariana, but feel free to, yeah, jump in as well.
Yeah, I also want to remind, no pressure, Hazim, but if you have anything that you want to talk about in any of the presentation, but also in the ESL series that you were part of, feel free to jump in at any time.
That was so long ago. Like, I remember you coming over and I had that tiny ass room that was just infested with mice all the time. And there was barely any space for you to, I mean, you did what you did, which is amazing in that space. But it's interesting to see the word Malay, because I think what it reminded me of was that I tended to, because of my experiences as a stateless person, as a former refugee, is romanticizing home as like straddling the line between diaspora and also having a lot of steeped experiences in my actual homeland, like quote unquote homeland, was that I tended to romanticize dynamics back home by utilizing the word Malay, whereas Malay as a word now, it can have negative connotations in terms of implying a Malay nationalism or a Malay supremacy. And so the dynamics between me being a person of color here and racialized global South, but also the dynamics of back home and how do you straddle that. So I don't use Malay actually anymore because it's so laden with this reification of Malay supremacy. I mix as well, so it's another kind of form of straddling. So I use Bahasa, which is, so instead of using Malaysia or Indonesia, I refer to Nusantara, and with your piece about, or like when you were talking about Caribbean and reimagining the boundaries of what Caribbean means or can mean, I definitely connect my application of using Bahasa instead of Malay to this reimagining of what my region could be. So I actually, it's like a little throwback. It just reminded me of like, oh yeah, I don't use Malay anymore, you know? I use Bahasa because engaging with different dynamics that often get glossed over in conversations about diaspora, right?
Mhm.
Because people here would not know about dynamics back home, and I always feel like I have a duty to not like simplify it for people I'm speaking to here, right? Like, so yeah, but thank you. Like, also, it's so great to see you and your. So anyway, yes, I will turn off my mic.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hazim. And that's definitely like, the ebb and flow that is evident even in the style of Antonio Benitez Rojo's writing. And this ebb and flow, this rhythm and return that he talks about, like that's reflected in what you were just talking about in your relationship to not only this term, but your relationship to your own history and your different geographies that you're a part of. Yeah, so I think like there's all these connected thoughts that are coming up.
And Hajim, I also started thinking recently, I think, have you read Gayatri Gopinath's Unruly Visions yet? It's fantastic. But like it really made me rethink like how I also like define myself and like identify in Canada now. Because I've never felt Indian, like not even while like I lived in India. And it's always I've had this like Punjabi identity. So how do we sort of focus on the region and not try to like fall back on or like simplify the nation or like the national project that's actually very actively trying to erase us. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, just like this idea of returns as well. Mariana, I'm wondering if you can talk about like your earlier projects and like how this like desire to use language and like text in your work has also been like this sort of accumulation of like thinking, but also like rethinking and yeah, just how it's sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess thinking about like returns and the way that I use language in my work. I guess I use language. Sometimes it's written. Very rarely it's like a poem. Sometimes I do poetry, but it's not really. I feel like I'm not like a poet. It just comes out of me once in a while. And then sometimes it's spoken as well, either through like narration in a video or doing a reading. So, in terms of my relationship to language, as someone who's bilingual, I know Spanish and English. Um, I often think about the way that language can transport me and other bilingual people, whether it's through intentional or accidental practices of code switching, where that just means, yeah, it can be intentional or accidental, where you flow from one language into another language. And code switching is something that can happen with different vernacular languages. So like different types of slang carry their own types of meaning as well. So sometimes code switching is talking about, different slang, different like more recognized languages, that switching between. And to me, that really is like a switching, not only of the words that I'm saying or that I'm thinking, sometimes it happens in my head, but also a transporting to a different geography or a different time, or a different memory. So language to me is very connected to the psychological and the geographical and the emotional. And I consider myself a photo-based or a lens-based artist. So I kind of view photography as being able to do the same thing as well. Obviously very connected to memory. Um, and yeah, I see this engagement with photos as something that can transport the person engaging with a photograph either emotionally or to a different time and place. Yeah, and then also thinking about like in my earlier projects, I was interested in, I guess I was more so interested in questions of immigration, and then started questioning like my presence and my presence and role in the settler colonial system, and thinking about how I don't see Spanish anywhere really here in Winnipeg, and then kind of making connections to how I see different versions, different expressions of Spanish, but then also like Nahuatl is like the most popular indigenous language used in Mexico, or represented in the region known as Mexico. So then thinking about like obviously different indigenous peoples here, their relationship to language and visibility, and what that means as well for place and relationships to place and respecting the land and the histories here.
Yeah, because in your curatorial work, you're also like working with artists like Joy T. Arcand, who is like making language visible through like photographing the landscape or like playing with the landscape. Yeah, so like your curatorial practice also sort of kind of comes into this thinking about like how do we sort of disrupt these languages, including photography, as we saw, like especially in ESL, there's like a glitch, there's like a visual disruption that plays with how sacred photography was in like this colonial era for a very long time. So yeah, like I'm really excited how you're disrupting in so many different registers. And I also want to ask one question. We have about 10 minutes for discussion, so feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. But in the meantime, I also wanted to ask Mariana about her MA, and how I think when you started thinking about doing your MA, you also wanted to find the theoretical language to, understand and add different layers to your work. So can you talk a little bit about your desire to use text or theory?
Yeah, that's actually, I guess one thing that's come out of finishing grad school, I just finished last year, is a desire to share these resources and this access to textual resources that I have. Just because these concepts, like when we try to understand the function and the mechanisms of colonialism, as is shown in this article, The Repeating Island, there's like multiple layers to this machine that we can call the colonial machine, and there's other machines that are part of this machine. So obviously, like depending on your history and your experience, some people can understand that very intimately. But the function of this power structure of settler colonialism is also to make itself invisible. So it can also be really hard to understand and to access. So yeah, going into this master's program, I wanted to gain some more knowledge and some more language to be able to talk about it and to process it in my own creative work, whether that's curating or writing or making art. So one thing that I hope to carry on through my own artwork and this reading group that was part of your exhibition, Noor, is very much in line with sharing these resources through reading groups or through workshops, and making space for these creative ways of processing this really complex mechanism that's occurring in all of our worlds. And then also going into my MA, I was interested in learning about other artists who are working with language. So yeah, so I did a lot of thinking about Joy Arcan's work, who I love. Patrick Cruz has a really interesting piece called Stepmother Tongue, where he combines some existing languages and some symbols that he makes up to kind of create like a different path of reality and history. A lot of writers that work with language as well and think about the knowledge that's embedded in language and the different worldviews that just come with different languages. And yeah, I feel like I'm really interested in thinking about the potentials of like multilingualism and bilingualism for different entry points into understanding the world just through these values carried through the language.
I think I approached like maybe my master's a little bit more like promiscuously. I was just excited to like stay in school and read whatever I wanted. But with my PhD, it's definitely a desire to understand a bit more the language that's not very accessible or like erased, and try to really think through those erasures and silences. So yeah, I think I'm very much in line with that. And I have a message from Denise, but is it supposed to be private or can I read?
Oh no, it was just a comment and I didn't want to interrupt the conversation, so it can be, yeah, shared.
Do you want to share it?
Sure. I guess now that I've interrupted. Oh no, I was just mentioning, Mariana, that I really like, when you're talking about your research and your use of limestone and how that connected between Manitoba and Morelos, and yeah, how that underlined your use of this material. That was, I mean, amazing in itself, but also, listening to the following conversation around diaspora, and kind of these being in between two places that you also point out in your work. And I just found myself thinking how appropriate this like heavy material was to that. And, the idea of like always, yeah, being between two places, but also always being absent from a place at any one time. You're always absent from somewhere. I mean, even if you're born, say, in my case, I was born here, but there's a home that's somewhere else that I'm always absent from. That my parents refer to or my family refers to, and just the heaviness of that. And then also Hazim, I think a few people have mentioned just even like political situations at home, and kind of feeling the entanglement in that. So there's just never a lightness to the experience. So yeah, it was just astounding, like how, like the connections that you made with the limestone and monuments and institutions, but then also to the experience, or your experience.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely like so complicated to consider all these migrations through history and culture, and yeah, and I think also connects to like Hazim was saying, like questions of nationalism, and even Noor, like questions of how you relate to certain identities and how that changes over time.
And we have one more question from Lisa Ravna as well.
Hi, it's maybe more like a combination of question, comments, because I have 3 languages. So I speak English, and then of course there is the Norwegian language, which is the colonial language, and then Sami, which is my indigenous language. I'm thinking of the differences between these languages. When I think and speak in Sami, there is a very different connection to my environment and to the land that sort of reflects in the way that I articulate, but also in the terms that I use. What you were saying just now about how our worldviews, our ontologies are present in language. But this is completely absent, at least for me, in both Norwegian and English. I don't feel that same sense of connection. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, how connections and the act of making kin is present in some languages, but then completely gone in others.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that comment. And that's really, yeah, interesting to learn a little bit about your relationship to the Sami language too. That just reminded me of an article that I read quite a few years ago. I guess it would have been around 2015 or something. But related to your comment, it was an article by a psycholinguist. Oh, her name escapes me right now, but I'll find it and share it with Noor, who can maybe share it with everyone later. But the author was talking about her experience as an immigrant. Oh, I can't remember from where. It was a while ago that I read it, but Eastern Europe, and immigrating to Montreal as a child with her family. So she talked about her first language loss and how there were, later on as an adult, there were terms of endearment that she realized she didn't know anymore to refer to her parents and to talk to her parents. So yeah, and it just connected with what you were saying about even like relationship to land and relationship to place. There's just these things that are untranslatable. You know, even if we try to translate them into English or into Norwegian or another language, it's just not quite the same. So yeah, so I think that there's connections to be made between these relationships between humans and even non-human beings, and how that's reflected in the values that are embedded in different languages.
Yeah. And I was like, while I was reading the article, I was also thinking about when Rojas talked about, you know, how do we combine or how do we merge or how do we crash together like languages of utopia and languages of history. And I thought about this exhibition I saw in Lithuania. I don't know if I've talked about it before, but it's like probably one of the most important quotes of my life. It was an exhibition of Jonas Mekas' work, which included text, video, and then I just like stumbled upon this phrase where he talked about the only way to utopia is through your own language, and it still like resonates with me, because like the only way back to your village, the only way back to anything or forward to anything is through your language. And it's so exciting because we do talk about utopia as like a way of lightening this load of history and making sense of history, and yeah, and how language plays such an important part in doing that work. But yeah, I also loved the way Rojo's like wrote. It was so poetic, and I mean, he is a writer before being a scholar, so yeah, his style was also really exciting.
Yeah, and I think part of his style too, that I just remember talking about it in class when we did this reading in school, but I guess I don't know very much about chaos theory, but there was talk about him employing chaos theory into this text, which just connects, as far as I understand, to that anti-explorer figure, not being able to know or to pin down everything, and only being able to describe some things as this thing happened in a certain kind of way, and I can't quite find the words to say exactly what it is. So yeah, so I feel like that's employed in even the style that he's writing in. It's very layered and very complex, and there's, you know, he talks about like the machine and the machine and the machine. And yeah.
Yeah. And Yeah, I really will talk about this after too, Mariana. But do folks have like a final question or a comment before we close today?
A comment about the language. Lisa, you mentioned about Norwegian and Sami. I mean, Norwegian, I would say it's a very, very poor language relatively, like norska är fattig. Det tror jag är enig om det. It's just, I don't know, I mean, my vocabulary is very good in Norwegian too. And then I compare to English, I mean, I would be limited. I think like as not someone who grew up with English, I don't know that many fancy words. But then I know Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, like Noor, and I think that gives us the insight of how rich a language can be. And Lisa, you know Sami, so you know there is a greater potential than, for example, those who only speak Norwegian. So maybe for those who are like not bilingual with more of these richer languages, it's probably also hard to get that perspective. So sometimes it can sound like we're just romanticizing the languages, but I think like some languages are very, very rich, and those who know them, they kind of tie their identity a bit stronger towards that. And also, like Hazim said about romanticizing our backgrounds, our heritage in one way or the other, like this identity part, it becomes so stronger, and this is something like not something abstract, our parents' cultures or our former cultures where we grew up. So it just becomes so like something very specific. Same with languages. I just think like I also got like Mariana, when you were talking about it, it just feels like emotional in a weird way. So I started romanticizing it like while you were talking. So it was really nice to just get those perspectives.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks, Senza.
But like it's exciting that Rojo's right like talks about like Creole language and like other languages that came out of English as well, or like were formed through like entanglement of different kinds. And yeah, so I feel like I'm not completely ready to give up English because so many people, so many communities have also put their roots in it and made it what it is, including, what is it? English?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, that's like a Hindi, like a Desi style of English. Sorry for taking up too much space.
No, that's okay. I guess I know we're trying to end things, but I feel like this conversation could go on forever. But that just reminded me too of another really great text that I learned about in this class where I learned about Antonio Benitez Rojo. I might have shared it from a different presentation from Gives On and With, but it was Edward Kamau Brathwaite's text, Nation Language, where he's talking about the Creole languages, or he calls them nation languages, that came out of this amalgamation of the existing indigenous languages in the Caribbean, the African languages that were brought over, and this colonial languages that were also brought over. And yeah, just the amalgamation of those and the production or the expression of something new. So yeah, it's interesting to think about what kind of worldviews and values are translated into the creation of something new like that.
Yeah, and this was the perfect text again to like think about that. So yeah, thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you everybody who joined today for your generous spirit and smiles and questions. This is the final reading session for Gives On and With, which closes March 15th.
20th. 20th. Closes on 20th. A little bit extended.
March 20th, and yeah, this has just been such a generative and generous process, as Lori mentioned. And yeah, I'm so excited to continue thinking alongside everybody who took part in this project And yeah, I want to thank all the artists, Mariana Muñoz Gomez, Zenia Nakvi, Ayman Al-Azraq, Luanda Carnero Yacuel, and also the Glam Collective, and of course, Lori and Denise, who were here to support every week, and Denise for also sharing incredible texts with me throughout this process. So thank you everybody for today, and I'm looking forward to reconnecting in different places and times.
Yeah, thank you all so much